So I would like to introduce our next panel, which is on waterfronts, water resiliency and design for climate change. We are going to be hearing from our moderator. So we have Britany, and she's coming to us from Executive Director of Michigan's University Research Center. Thank you so much. We have Matthijs Bouw that is joining us also virtually, and he's the founding partner of One Architecture. We have Director Liesl Clark that is with us from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And we will be having Zach joining in a momentarily as well. So, Britany, I leave it to you.
Thank you, Ivana.
Yes.
I first just want to welcome everyone who's in the room with us and everybody who is online. Welcome. I'm really excited about this panel today. It's a topic that certainly in my day job at the University Research Corridor, which is an alliance of Michigan's 3 Research One institutions, so Michigan State University, the University of Michigan, and Wayne State University. It's something that we've had researchers focused on this for a long time, urban flooding, and particularly from the perspective of how do you mitigate that to reduce the environmental threat to human health. And we're on the innovation side. Today, we have a set of panelists, experts, who will be talking more, how do you incorporate design, resilient design into redeveloping our resources, our infrastructure to address urban flooding, which is an issue we've certainly experienced here in Detroit, all across Michigan. It's something I know in the Netherlands, and it's really across the world. So, and it's only going to intensify as we continue to experience climate change. So, just a little bit of a preview. These experts come from public and private sectors. They're going to focus on the resilient design to address flooding in our communities. The design is intended to be sustainable over time, given the climate crisis and available streams of revenue. Panelists are going to share with you real-world examples in an effort to learn from different seemingly unique cases, but what lessons we can learn from each other and apply to other communities. So with that, I am going to start the conversation with Director Clark from Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes, and Energy, or what we call EGLE. So she's going to help us frame the issue of how the climate crisis is driving change in our cities. Hi, Liesl.
Hi, Britany.
Always. You've played a key role in formulating and overseeing implementation of Governor Gretchen Whitmer's Michigan Healthy Climate Plan, which is a roadmap to achieving economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2050. Nobody said you weren't ambitious, right? It was published in April of this year. Could you give us a brief overview of this plan, why plans like this one are important for states and communities to develop, and maybe share some specifics in the plan that are focused on addressing urban flooding, such as the catastrophic floods I referred to in Midland and also here in Detroit this last year?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Britany. Really appreciate the question and appreciate the opportunity to be here on this panel and have a chance to visit with everybody. You know, it's great that we can take the virtual hybrid model away from COVID and use it as an opportunity to connect us. So this, international connection, having folks online, as well as, of course, all of you in the room who we really appreciate. So it's nice to be able to have that as a takeaway. So I'm the director of Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And in 2019, when the governor reorganized the department, she elevated a few important key components like the Office of Environmental Justice Public Advocate, the Office of the Clean Water Public Advocate, and importantly, the Office of Climate and Energy. She also set targets to commit the state to, and those were a component of what the Council on Climate Solutions deliberated on to help the department craft the plan. Like other plans in the climate space, I think a couple of things are important up front. I really like the Eisenhower quote that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. I think that's really true. At the kickoff for the plan this spring here in April, Frank Adewagishik, who's with the United Tribes of Michigan, said that words are just words on paper. What really matters is the passion and the energy that we put to them to executing them. And I really think that that's true, particularly when you look at a plan like this. But it creates an important framework for us from the state perspective to understand how we fit into the bigger work around climate change. Like other plans, there's a focus on equity and making sure that as we transition to no carbon emissions, we're doing so in a way that takes everyone along for the ride, particularly people in our underserved communities who've been overburdened by some of the challenges from past industry. Of course, focuses on greening the grid, critical component of the work that we need to do going forward. Weatherization and the built environment. Also a key factor being mobility. As we know, transportation surpassed power generation as the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions a couple of years ago here in the US overall. So mobility is a really critical component of how we transition. And then, of course, a focus on natural and working lands. And from a Michigan perspective, again, it's a uniquely Michigan plan. There's a big focus on industry and what's necessary to help industry transition. We've had a lot of solid background work done by our industry, our manufacturers here in Michigan, but innovation is really going to be necessary to take that segment of our emissions forward. So the plan addresses all those areas, most importantly, built on the work of locals and communities. We created the Catalyst Communities effort at EGLE to make sure that we were raising up communities in the state that were already doing work around climate, but then also giving the communities that were interested but maybe didn't have as much of an understanding of how they fit into the picture, an opportunity to see where they were going. And so the Catalyst Communities effort is a way to make sure that we're building those connections and aggregating that interest. So before I hand it back, I do want to spend a quick second on our water infrastructure in the state of Michigan, because I think that's an important kind of grounding thing to understand. A study from a couple years ago suggested that our water infrastructure was in need of approximately $800 million per year in order to get it back to baseline and to keep it in good shape. Michigan's infrastructure was built quite a while ago. We are a manufacturing state. We're one of the early states. We're early heavy industry. And so a lot of our infrastructure was built, 30 to 40 years ago, even longer, which means that it's undersized for the type of weather events that we're getting right now. And it's also does not have the type of solid maintenance that's necessary over time. So fortunately, over the last few years, we've been able to invest, the Whitmer administration has invested $4 billion in water infrastructure, but we know that there's still more to do there. We joke all the time, you may be familiar, our governor talks about fixing the damn roads. We joke all the time that we need to fix the damn pipes. And when you're driving on a 20, 30, 40-year-old road, you don't know when you're drinking water out of a 20, 30, 40-year-old pipe. And these storm events that Britany mentioned, because our infrastructure was undersized and because climate change is causing bigger storms, or in some cases, not even necessarily bigger, but bigger events with more water coming at once, that undersized infrastructure really needs our attention. So happy to be part of this discussion here today. And I'm also looking forward to learning from our other panelists too.
Thanks. And, you bring up a point. A few years ago, we were working with the Henry Ford Museum. We were having a conference around what to do with water infrastructure. And they brought to us a pipe that had just been pulled out from underneath one of the Detroit roads that was a water pipe made out of a log. It was a log, and is over 100 years old, and it is still here. We have those legacy aspects to our infrastructure. So it's a good point. Thanks, Liesl. Next, I'm going to turn to someone who knows a little something about resilient design, or a lot. Resilient design, as we're focused on, is a cornerstone to developing sustainable solutions to urban flooding. And Matthijs, you have made contributions to tackling environmental challenges by applying resilient design. Recently, you helped develop the concept for the Big U, which is a set of design and environmental interventions meant to protect Lower Manhattan from floods, storms, and other threats from climate change. Could you provide a brief overview of what resilient design is and where it should fit into the planning efforts of our cities and states?
Thank you, Britany, for that question, and thank you for having me here. Resilience is defined in various ways, but I'll try and bring a perspective which mostly is from a response to the climate crisis, where we know that our extreme weather events are changing. Our climate is changing rapidly and increasingly rapidly in unpredictable ways with incredible outliers. You talked about it before, Liesl, that we have much bigger storms and downpours all at once. Catherine Hayhoe once called that global weirding rather than global warming. But we also know that all these impacts that come with the climate crisis are impacting vulnerable communities, for instance, the most. And so these impacts are exacerbated by underlying structural challenges and inequities. And from that perspective, resilience has been defined as a way to create and increase the capacity for individuals or communities or institutions or systems in general within a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. And what is interesting, I think, about that definition is, on the one hand, we understand disasters, the shocks, but we also need to really consider the chronic stresses that exacerbate the impacts of these shocks. And there's been some scientific literature about what are then the components of resilience. And I'll use one text. I'm also an academic, so apologies for that. That has a number of terms that I think are really important to consider when doing resilient design. And I'll illustrate those with our work on the Big U and the different follow-up projects that we're currently working on. So if you're dealing with these complex systems and trying to make sure that we can bounce back, but also that they can help us transform, one of the important aspects is multifunctionality. It is that you not only design for one particular risk, but that you really make sure that you design for multiple risks at once. Often different risks are very much related. We know that water issues are a big part of designing for increased heat, for instance. We know that climate risk and biodiversity risk are interrelated. So it's really important to have a lens that you design for more things, and that you not only design for risks, but also for benefits that you could have for the benefits in the community. So multifunctionality is a really important component. Another thing that the Ayer text said is you need to think about redundancy and modularization. We know that there are risks that are known, but there are also risks that are unknown. And so, and we don't know, we cannot model exactly the impact of risks because they might be much more than we expect, as we see in recent storms. So that's where it's really important to build our system such that if one thing fails, that there is a backup. But we also need to think about how we can, because we need to do a lot of work, how we can create our systems and design our systems such that they are modular, that they can build on each other over time. And for instance, when we do that work in Manhattan, we rather than designing one big infrastructure for 10 miles, we create compartments that can each be sort of adapted over time. Some of these compartments have different design criteria, depending a bit on the community desires, on the urban situation that we're in. So trying to think about how are you sensitive to the different communities and different contexts is very important. Then another element that is really important is sort of celebrate diversity. Diverse systems, being biological systems or social systems, are often much more resilient systems. So really focus on making sure that whatever you design is really connected to the communities that you work with, lived experience and is critical in understanding what is at stake. It's also really important to then build capacity within those communities so that the communities can be sort of stewards for these type of solutions. And I have the picture on the background of one workshop that we had with kids in Manhattan, where we really want to train them to become the community stewards for these long-term projects. But it also means building diversity, that you'd like to use not only gray infrastructure, but also nature-based solutions, where you harness the power of nature to deal with all kinds of climate stresses. We can think of marshlands, or in the global south, mangroves. We can think of stormwater, green infrastructure for stormwater retention. Another component for designing resilience is thinking about, let's say, multi-scalar networks and connectivity. We now know that our coastlines are changing, either by design, because we build protective systems around them, but also by the impacts of sea level rise or changes in the climate as you have on the lakes. And that means that that also the urban water management will start to change as well. So understanding how those systems are related to each other is very important. You had a huge storm in Detroit about a year ago, where it was really clear that stormwater management needs to be adapted, but you cannot dissociate it from what you design on your coast. We have been working on a project called Rainproof, New York City, where we are really thinking about how to use green infrastructure to do our urban water management. Because Liesl, you're right, our infrastructure is undersized. It's undersized because it was mostly driven by the Clean Water Act, and now we have hazard mitigation, so we need it to be much bigger, and you cannot do that in a cost-effective way without using green infrastructure for stormwater management. And the last one is adaptive planning. So you really need to think about how you deal with uncertainty. You cannot invest all at once. So you're going to think of projects as a phase in a constant succession. So I'll stop here. Resilient design is thinking about multifunctionality, about redundancy and modularization, to create biological and social diversity, to think about networks and connectivity, and to start designing systems so that they can be as adaptive as they can be. Sorry for a small lecture. Apologies.
No, thank you, Professor. I appreciate it. So, that's really interesting. And I want to take that now to Zachary. Your work pairs your operational and entrepreneurial background with your passion for sustainable, resilient solutions to the urban environment. You co-founded Urban Rivers, which is an organization dedicated to transforming city rivers into urban wildlife sanctuaries. Your current project is the Wild Mile Chicago. And it's going to be, when completed, the first ever floating eco park of its scale in the world. I'm very excited because it's relatively close by to check it out when it's done. Could you share with us, Zachary, more about the Wild Mile, what it is, what impact it will have, and how resilient design is incorporated into the planning, particularly given your background is not in design, and maybe also given what we just heard from Matthijs, how important it is to bring in various folks who are from the community into that design process. So,
great. You guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So sorry, we have a party with the deputy mayor, and we're running around, and so I do apologize. My voice is a little coarse, but it's great to be here. And yeah, the Wild Mile was birthed 8 years ago. One of the other co-founders, Josh Yellen, put a little 5x10 garden in the North Branch Channel as part of his thesis program, a project in the University of Illinois. Nick and I separately were just trying to grow hemp and switchgrass as a biofuel, just experimenting with hydroponics because we thought the river was a place to grow plants. And Nick and I don't have that traditional background. And as we navigated and met Josh and someone who's actually doing it, and we saw it like physically, we're like, we could build like a park with these things, a kayak park of some sort. The thing is, I had background in logistics, so I knew about the interwaterways and how cities were built off of logistics. And that knowledge came back into that moment where obviously they're not used anymore. And seeing that 5x10 garden inspired us, like, well, we could have a lot of these, thinking it was simple. Obviously, regulatory wise, we've had a lot of, issues with creating precedents. But anyway, fast forward, we've done these pilots, and the Wild Mile is going to be a place that forces access. One of the things that Nick and I did early on was that we took our kayaks, and I was living in Chicago, and we were walking to find access, and we walked for like 3 hours and just like nothing reasonable. And with that experience, we built something that forces people to build access, and it's pretty. And it's obviously over years of trial and error. We'll get to the point where these activating areas of the river, whether it be habitat, walkway, one or the other, will be a vortex to create the one problem that we feel is access. Because once you get to the engineering and the permitting and the funding, like of course those are difficult, but it's really the access point, which is taking a dead end, opening it up, gangway down. That once that happens, which we did here in our first section, there's a huge ripple effect. And so that's what we learned. And back to the point about resilience, well, you could create all these beautiful things on the river, right? And they can be sustainable and they can be maintained, but if the public doesn't go there and the visitors don't go there and they take ownership, well, that project can be flushed out pretty quickly. It doesn't have the same community protection that it needs to be a long-term park. And obviously you think about those in parks like the Brooklyn Bridge Park and things in Houston, all the community drives around it and they take ownership. So the resilience is yes, the plants and the maintenance, but it's the community and the access, and they work together. So once you touch it and become an intimate part of that project, your resiliency is increased because people will protect and fight for it. And so yes, from a habitat ecological, you cleaning the water and you're bringing habitat, and that's a resilient factor. But to create what we feel is real resiliency is the community will always protect that part of the river that you've activated, or that garden, or that parklet that you turn from a parking lot into a garden, which is on land. We obviously work with water. And so that's kind of a way that we've kind of creating these ownership connections with community. And resiliency can be answered in many ways, but it's a big part of it. And the second part that I'll say is that our installs, the gardens that you see on the surface with the nuts and bolts and plants, are about 90% constructed, planted, and built. They don't get anchored as much. We have a specific team that does that, but they do it with their hands. And so if you go to a park on land, very few people would have put a bolt into that swing set. And that's another part of the resiliency that we feel is got what they call in business school the stickiness factor, right? Because like I said, I didn't go to design or ag school. So that's kind of two examples. There's many more, of course.
Thank you. And for those of you in the room who have your devices and those online, I want to encourage you to go online and check out what this looks like. You can just Google Wild Mile Chicago and check it out. And while you're on the internet checking it out, check out also the Big U, and make sure you stop by and check out My Healthy Climate Plan. It's MI, Healthy Climate. We name everything here in Michigan MI, my. So those are really interesting if you want to learn more about them, and that's great. Now, a quick question: we have Ben with us. Do you have Ivana? I think we may just if he joins us, we'll skip back to that. So I want to go to thinking about those of you here. All of you are hailing from communities. You have your own sort of interests and issues and challenges, and you likely have a lot of questions around urban flooding. And so you may be asking how you can plan for success and maximize the impact of your projects. Looking at your experiences, it seems what's critical to success from the panelists here is assembling the right partners, securing sustainable funding, and managing expectations and relationships. I think we heard that from some of our previous panels as well. Who's inside the planning process is really important. Who's included? Thinking about who's not there, who should be. And I heard that in our prep calls quite a bit as well. And so that's in addition to developing the best right design for a project. Process is key. So the how you do things and who sits at the table. So the next set of questions are going to go to this issue: how to ensure public-private collaborations thrive in building resilient public spaces. So environmental justice, that's a big issue and it is an important element in all of your work. We know that those with limited means, people of color, and or those residing and working in environmentally vulnerable locations are disproportionately impacted by urban flooding driven by climate change. So, and this will just be a jump ball for all of you. In developing a statewide plan, as you have done in Michigan, or on the ground developing a solutions-focused community project like Zach and Matthijs, who is invited to the planning table? Who decides the best design? How are the voices of those most impacted included in your process?
If it's a toss-up or just to grab the ball here, this is the huge, I just had a meeting with the DPD 2 weeks ago about community involvement with design, how they involve. So it's tricky because at the end of the day, like myself, but I've been 8 years into this project, not everyone's a designer, right? And so like you have to understand that they may not understand what's possible. They are mostly going to be fighting for green space. We're a little different because we're taking rivers that were just rivers that no one used and creating green space versus like people that acquire land and then people are like, oh, you want to build a high rise and retail, but you got to make a soccer field. So we have a little less resistance, but for the integration of community, design, we've gone to students, we've gone to members to find out what activity do they like, what type of programming do they like, right? And obviously we're a very unusual project. We're very, linear against the river. We're not like a big field and big parklet. And so we try to like look at the programming, right? And try to match that with the design, because a lot of people think of design that is not really possible or it's really expensive. And we do these charrettes. Charrettes I know could be really good. They could be really like flat, and it depends on who shows up, who's got the passion and the energy, of the community. And what we've learned over the years in doing these charrettes is that, listen, we're gonna have gardens, and we're gonna have walkway, and we're gonna have space. So like for us, it's got like there's only so many things we can do, maybe a pet bridge, a couple benches and stuff. But we go with that design and we kind of bring in the programming that people want. Do they want to do yoga on the Wild Mile? Do they want to have classes? And so like our first section was called Learning Platform because what the goal was to bring 30 students down and do a class. So we've tried to mirror the programming to kind of match design where that matches more with the person than, hey, is this like engineering possible? And we still want to hear that, right? But we've tried to over the years incorporate the learning of what they want, programming, how do they want to activate it, and then we kind of go to the drawing board more and take control of that, and then maybe offer a couple options and like go back and forth, right? But that's how we've kind of had that balance where they have a say, but they're not so worried about what wood panel it has and how much square footage the walkway can or can't be in certain parts of the river, because that's like a regulatory permitting issue sometimes. So that's kind of how we've tackled it over in time, and we've only built 400 linear feet, so there's like 1/15 of it's done. So we'll probably continue that approach more often. So the place that what we're building with our hands is activated in the sense that they feel connected to. So I know it's like not so much a design answer, but that's how we've seen more of a connection with the community, and try to be thoughtful with that. So
Who's next? Yes.
I can talk about maybe Liesl. You want to go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think about it from two directions. From the department's perspective, obviously we have a key role both on the regulatory side and the community outreach that's necessary there. But then also as we're encouraging projects and things that we're able to be aware of and invest in, how do we make sure that the community is engaged in those efforts as well? So community engagement is a key role. Excuse me, sorry. Community engagement is a key component of the My Healthy Climate Plan, and making sure that we have attention paid to equity issues all across the work that we do from a climate perspective. But it's a really core component of what we do in the permitting world too. So as I mentioned up front, When we were reorganized by the governor early in 2019, important component of that was the Office of Environmental Justice Public Advocate. And you hear that term public advocate because the role is different than what you see in a lot of regulatory agencies. To have a public advocate seated in your department and sitting with the programmatic people to, again, make sure that we are inviting voices to the table and that we're being very expansive about how we do that. So it's, making sure that we've got a lot of translation services available, making sure that we've used an environmental justice screening tool to look at the communities that we're talking to. And so that we're considering up front, like what sort of challenges there might be and ways that we might need to tailor that outreach to make sure that we're hitting people where it's best to communicate with them. To me, another positive coming out of COVID was all these different communication methods. Michigan statute, sadly, is a little bit dated, referring to newspaper postings and things like that, which really don't work in our world. And so what I always tell the team is you have to do it all. You've got to do the newspaper postings and the things that the statute require, but then you also, we're doing webinars, we're doing, phone outreach, we're doing email outreach, we're receiving comments online. We need to use every tool in addition to being actively in the community where possible. And in some cases where we're directly supporting projects, like there's a Ox Creek revitalization effort that's ongoing in Benton Harbor right now. We're actually working with some friends at U of M. And so I'm not sure if it's one that Zach's involved with or not, but it's a opportunity for river redevelopment that runs right through Battle Creek. And it's super interesting. I've toured the site a few times, and there's a lot of legacy contamination issues that the department's involved in, working with other partners like our friends at the federal level, Army Corps of Engineers, obviously Environmental Protection Agency and others, to figure out what resources can we put to start with the contamination issue. But you can really, when you tour this area of Battle Creek, you can really see how, because of the way that it was not seen as a green space over time, so it's not been maintained in that way. It ends up running right through the middle of Battle Creek and in some respects really dividing the community because you've got to have bridges to cross over it, but it's not something that, has some of your, more traditional go to the river walks, that utilization component that Zach was just talking about. So, we see it from both angles, both on the permitting side and making sure that, we've invited people to the table and encourage the permittees to invite people to the table, but also really specifically on projects where, we're pushing and supporting the project and making sure that the community outreach is an important component of that.
Thank you.
When you talk about urban water management or stormwater management, one of the things that you need to realize is that every drop counts. And that really should inform your engagement strategy, because that means that you have to engage with multiple asset owners. Those could be public, those could be private, those could be individuals, those could be renters. So you really need to think about that. But you also, if you do it well, there's a lot of benefits that come, for instance, with green infrastructure as a way to address stormwater challenges. So thinking about the multiple benefits that these infrastructures can bring is equally important. So you need to be really broad in your engagement. You need to be broad in building up understanding of these issues and engagement within communities, because people can help address this problem even on their own private property. And there are various ways of doing that. We talked earlier about engaging school kids. One of the things that we are doing in Houston, for instance, where especially in vulnerable communities, people are difficult to reach, we have a neighborhood support team built of community leaders, or people that know their community very well, to bring in that, to help us reach out to the community, to help us understand the lived experiences, etc., and that those act as an intermediary, for instance. But you not only need to engage the community, the private sector, businesses need to be engaged, and they might need to be engaged in a very different way. You can show them, for instance, that if they don't address these things or help address these things, that they're going to have significant risks in the future, which could have monetary or implications for them, or which could have implications for their operations. So that could be a different conversation. But there again, you could also show to the private sector there are benefits. We have been working in Amsterdam, for instance, with garden centers or nurseries to help with them to create sort of thematic gardens that could help them convey to their public or to their customers how you can create green gardens that can manage stormwater, and then it becomes a business opportunity for those garden centers. Another really important constituency to engage on these things is different agencies. Often these are new infrastructures that have impacts across different agencies, that also have benefits across different agencies. We've talked earlier about not only risk reduction, but also improves health or human services. They can function as a sort of social infrastructure. So workshopping with those agencies, what is possible, how different agendas can be combined, but also how they navigate challenges across jurisdictions or across budgets is really important. So I really feel that engagement is a multifaceted thing for which there are different solutions. But if you think about the factor that every drop counts, it is really important to take it extremely serious and together build the capacity that is needed to deal with the climate crisis, because it's no joke.
So, we've been talking a lot about inclusion and making sure everyone is included who has an impact. I mean, one of the things about flooding is it impacts so many different communities and so many people from different walks of life. The impact is disproportionately harmful for those with fewer resources. However, everyone is impacted in some way. And so there are many voices to include. On the flip side of trying to reach everyone and bring them into the tent, how do you navigate competing interests? Because it's not as though those voices all are saying the same thing. There are going to be different views, and the bigger the tent, the more views, right? So how can you provide just maybe a little bit of, like, on the one hand, it's great to bring everyone in, but then once you have everyone in, how do you navigate forward together? I think you're on mute, Zach.
Sorry, my voice. Yeah, so we jumped into community that we didn't know, and an area that went from industrial corridor to the opposite, and so like really had a lot of like how do I say, polarizing opinions. But well, we were able to really corral people about the project that is for everyone. But you have to be mindful that not all partners can add value at certain stages of a project. And so you have to be very diligent. Like right now we're in the phase of design and understanding, like how do you be thoughtful with the wildlife first design. And we did a framework plan, but even in the framework plan, 4 or 5 of those people that participated are not still a part of the project, because it was more of like a not one and done, but like their expertise kind of had take its course. And so like I feel partners change in different phases. We're like in the more startup phase, I guess, and we're growing. And now after 6 years, we're finally doing programming, and now we're trying to build those partners that really buy into the project, that can be long term. So we always try to find long term partners through each phase. Like Shad Aquarium has been with us for many years. Actually, some of our people actually work for them. And so it was very important to understand who could be long-term in each phase and then stick with them and build that long-term relationship, because, it's going to take another 6 years to build it, and hopefully this stays on for like a century. And so I think it needs to be okay with that. Some partners will fizzle out and some will be at different stages. Some people we reached out years ago are coming full circle because we weren't ready to do programming. So that's something for us, we've been okay with that, and the cycling of partnerships and making sure that they believe in our values and they're there for the long term. And so it's kind of a way we've assessed it, but it's never perfect. You always have to deal with the city. You always have to do regulatory bodies, especially with us in the water. But we've allowed to like keep that in its own box, and then the rest of the community, the design programming in a separate box. So
And I think we're going to get into the regulatory piece a little bit, but let me just tease out a little more of where I'm going with this, is that you're going into a community you weren't a part of initially, but obviously very passionate about. And so there are trust factors. There's familiarity, who you tend to trust people you're familiar with, right? Who you've had good experiences with. So how do you navigate that? Because I think in a lot of communities, that's a hurdle, right? We haven't always listened to everybody. How much listening is involved? And perhaps there's some specific examples you can provide there. Anyone on the panel?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think that particularly in the States lately, we've seen a real erosion of trust. And I think that that makes all the work that we do challenging, and frankly, a lot of what we do every day challenging. There's been a erosion in the, confidence and expertise in, that which, some of our experts bring to the table. But, it's also got to be balanced off with a point that you made, which is listening to people and frankly, the lived experience. So that's a really important component of how these projects go forward, making sure that you've got the lived experience at the table. I would just say that going back to one of Matthijs's points from earlier, it's being iterative and it's being willing to listen and willing to adapt, because where you start is probably the design you start with is probably not where you're going to end. And you're going to be better off if you take advantage of the expertise and the advice that you get from the community as you go along the way. Now, does that mean everybody gets everything? Certainly not. But that adaptive, iterative approach, I think, gets you to a much more successful outcome, and making sure that the lived experience is a key component of it as you go along the way.
Yeah, thank you.
I think
Matthijs, do you have anything to add?
that's super important, right? And this iterative process is and learning is really a key component of resilience. And what we started to do in Houston, where we do the neighborhood resiliency planning, is even while we are in the planning process, start executing projects, because we need to show to these neighborhoods that we mean business. If they look at us as planners from the outside, highly paid consultants who come to do their planning on behalf of some city agency that they do not trust, the planning process will not work. So in East Houston, in some of these neighborhoods, or in Houston, in some of these neighborhoods, we started executing small projects while we are in the middle of the planning process, to be able to celebrate that we're working together, to build trust, to learn from each other. And that really helps with the planning process. You need to start with the small steps to be able to create the big transformations.
Yeah, well said. And I just jump in there too and say, these might seem like simple principles, but be nice, be kind, understand that the other people around the table come with their own lived experiences and perspectives, and those are absolutely valuable as well. And, know that when people come to the table, they had an experience that day, they have a life, they have other challenges in front of them. And so, this might not be the only thing on their minds, and, be kind.
Humility wrapped in empathy, huh?
It's important.
Yeah. So let's get into a little more, and thank you for that. Let's get into a little more of what Zach just alluded to. And this is a big deal too. I hear this all the time from some of our innovators and so forth. Whenever you're working with water, there are many layers of regulation, the many different agencies, EGLE being one. There are many others, sometimes 5 or 6 that you have to go through to make a project work. So that presents one challenge, but there are others, aligning public and private partners, addressing the technical aspects of the design, just to name a few. And so maybe in the next few minutes before we get to Q&A, you can offer a few lessons to mind in your experience that have worked well for you, other than patience.
It's a real challenge. The regulatory environment in the United States is built on conservation, is to keeping the sort of small amount of nature, for instance, that is there, and not change anything further, right? It was a reaction to the extraction and the plundering of our natural resources in the past. And one of the challenges we now have is, if we want to build good resilience projects, we need to work with nature. We need to increase but change our natural systems so that they perform the ecosystem services that we need them to perform. We need to undo some of the mistakes of the past. And that puts an entirely different mindset on the regulatory framework, which is about change. The climate crisis is all about change, rather than about conserving what little that is there. Changing that mindset is very difficult. Changing the regulations are very, very difficult. And there again, I don't have a solution. The thing that I do find out is creating these small pilot projects and showing that things can be done better, and monitoring them, developing the metrics of how it works and how they work and what benefits they bring, often help us take the small steps to get us to a more, let's say, dynamic regulatory environment.
Thanks. And in just a minute, do you have much to add before we get to Q&A?
Yeah, you know, what I would say is my professional experience is 50% private sector, 50% public sector. And one of the things that I bring to this role is a need for innovation and a need for speed. And when you look at what we need to do in order to respond to the climate crisis, we have got to move much faster when it comes to the permitting and regulatory process. And so this is something that we've been super focused on within the department, and figuring out how do we move faster, because we think about the types of clean energy projects that need to be approved. We think about the types of resiliency work that needs to happen. We've got to move faster. Some of these projects are big and they're going to take time just because they're large projects. And obviously we have to make sure we spend time on the engineering and planning component, because you don't want to spend a lot of money on something that doesn't end up having the results that are necessary. However, like we've got to move with speed. And, one of the things I struggle with is how do we add people to our ranks so that we're moving much faster? We've got, in some cases, statutory deadlines for some of the permits that we turn around. We can't take, the 120 days that are in statute. This stuff's got to move a lot quicker in order to make sure that these projects are moving forward to meet the challenge of the moment that we're in right now. So.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A, and that is done right here. Yes, thank you.
On behalf of Woodbridge Council and Woodbridge Neighborhood Development. I have a couple of things that I'd like to ask. One of them is more general that you might be able to respond to, and one is more city specific, Detroit specific. Excuse me. First of all, earlier we heard about the shark bite versus the mosquito bite. So if you're tending to the shark bite, what can we as neighbors and block clubs on that lot by lot, block by block response do in terms of what changes can we make to our property? Matthijs, you talked about this sort of green infrastructure. What can we be doing to improve the landscaping in our neighborhoods? What can we be doing now? What resources are available, both financially or educationally? Because in our neighborhood and in other neighborhoods around the city, we do have strong neighborhood associations and block clubs who can start doing that work now. And people are out every year anyhow in their yards and their gardens. We can be doing that now if we have the knowledge and some resources to do that. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then more city focused, with the amount of development that's happening in Detroit now, there are provisions in the new zoning analytic for more green infrastructure and stormwater management. That is applying to developments on lots over 1 acre. A lot of the neighborhood level developments and the infill are on lots under ½ an acre, and they're not required to have any plan for that water management. And we know our neighborhoods are flooding. So it would be, what do we do to ensure that they are held to that same standard? And parking minimums, which are required in development here, are more than they need to be. but they also need to be hard surfaces. And there's no reason that parking needs to be a hard surface and not a permeable surface. And again, just having that pervious surface would allow so much more water to percolate through and not be rushing into our overtaxed and outdated stormwater system. So what can we be doing as residents and community associations to start making those changes and getting that done?
All right, I can start and I'll work my way backwards and connect the two actually together. So the first thing I would say is, I know this feels a little overused, but I just believe it to my core. Everything you do matters. Everything that you feel like is even a small step, like every step matters, and we all have to do everything that we can, right? So every step matters. So connecting your 2 points together, one of the things that is really important is disconnecting downspouts from your storm drains, right? That would make just a huge difference in the city of Detroit. And I know some of that work has happened, but that's one thing, like just alone, let alone, pollinators and, all the things, your impervious surfaces, like all the things that you're thinking about and able to work with your community groups on, like those things do matter. And they really, I remember when we were dealing with the first round of flooding last summer, we spent a lot of time talking about like, how do we get to the communities and get them to disconnect their downspouts? Because that alone will make such a huge improvement. As to, some of the issues that you raised with the Detroit specific components, the first thing I would say, because I would just like everybody to take this point away, policy matters. Policy drives outcomes. The policy matters. So just look at this example of local zoning for 1 acre and what a significance it has, right? Policy matters. Don't ever forget that. That's why I love my job. I don't know your specific question around, I don't know what's set by council, what's set by mayor's office, like that sort of thing. I do know that, your sustainability program, your climate program here is just really wonderful. It's top tier. The team's done a wonderful job of putting those pieces together. And I got to imagine that connecting the water resiliency components into it would really be a key part of what they're doing and a significant move forward. Again, if the Catalyst Communities work that we've got at EGLE is of any interest to you, like that's another place to go get information. The Green Communities Challenge, through Michigan Municipal League, they've done a really wonderful job of creating resources and creating community components that can help really with those direct actions. So hopefully these are some useful resources. Thank you. Yep.
Do you have Matthijs?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I often think about, especially what communities can achieve, right? If you think about stormwater management on a sort of plot level, you can have a green-blue roof, you can have rain barrels, you can also have a rain garden, you can do your landscaping such that it's much better able to manage and retain water. You can also, a lot needs to be solved in the streetscape, where you can have bioswales or conveyance channels and etc. And from a community perspective, I think they're helping people get the resources in order to make these changes is very important. But there's another thing that is really important. You often see that people don't like the wild looking rain gardens with all the stormwater and biodiversity benefits. They rather see lawns, and to have a conversation within the community that actually these wilder gardens are quite all right, and that actually those are things that we're gonna have to do and gonna have to learn to work with. Having those conversations at a block party, at a community meeting are really, really important, because often we see, for instance, that homeowners associations in many parts of the country are the biggest obstacle to changing your garden. They will not let you because they require a certain type of garden for neighborhood character. Same goes for streets. Of course, we need to reduce the space that we have for cars on our streets and start putting all these other functions in, play space, bike space, stormwater management space, heat reduction space, and having a conversation within the neighborhoods about how to bring those functions into your streetscapes, and with that create more social and cooler streets is really important. So I really feel that community organizations can have an incredibly big role in changing the perception about what a good neighborhood is.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes, and there's a question online. For the success of such impactful projects, how can public and private collaborations thrive in terms of building resilient public spaces? It's a
So do you want to
it's a
go
good
or shall I
question.
go? I'm
Go
not
ahead.
sure if Zach's still here. But like one of the things that, I mean, we are not financial specialists, but as designers, we realize that talking to businesses, you want to take the financial aspects into account. And so for a project in Amsterdam where we had to do their climate adaptation strategy, we started to give to businesses, developers, etc., the sort of numbers of the future impacts of climate risk if they didn't do a better job. And we also told them that if they would have to manage those that stormwater in their buildings, it will be much more expensive than if they collaborated between each other and with the municipality in finding other types of solutions. And by showing that number in a friendly way, we were able to sort of entice them into a process where they say, okay, let's start working together to have these green solutions in the public space, because they will be able to reduce the cost, but also generate the value. So I find that sometimes you just need to talk money at a relatively high level, but it can be incredibly effective in getting the private sector on board.
Right.
Well said.
Well, we are just about out of time. I just wanted to thank our panelists one more time for bringing their expertise to the table. Thank you for asking questions, and thank you.
Thank you all. It was fun being here.